How's everybody doing? Good, excellent. Okay, so my name is Imogen Coe. I'm the Dean of Science, and I'm going to talk to you about addiction biology. So, let's go. Addiction biology. Those two words are very powerful words. Addiction is a powerful word, and biology is a huge discipline. I'm going to break them apart and talk about each one of those words individually and then bring them back together to explain to you a little bit about why knowing the biology underlying addiction is really going to be a key in helping us help people with addiction. So addiction. What is addiction? I think everybody is familiar with oh, this poor soul is so addicted to the internet that the GIF is now exhausted and he's not even going to get up and go to his laptop there and go back to bed over and over again. We're all familiar with people that we know, and probably many of you out there, can I see any cell phones or any laptops, are very, very connected to technology. The modern world surrounds us with opportunities to indulge in behaviors that become very compulsive. We see this represented in the media. We all know somebody a little bit like Penny here who got completely obsessed with, I forget if it was Dungeons or Dragons or Minecraft, something, and Lord, did she need help. We also see it represented in some strange behaviors. This one was a new one to me, addicted to eating cat hair. Compulsive behaviors that are generally not good behaviors. And we know that there are individuals, many of them out there in popular culture, who have serious problems with addictive substances, and I would submit that these lead to very bizarre and unhealthy types of behaviors. So we're very familiar with addiction, or we think we know a lot about addiction in the modern world that's around us all the time. And we tend to think of these as being modern-day addictions, and there are so many of them. There are the technology addictions, there are food addictions, gambling, there are the substance abuse. We know that there are problems. We try to get people to stop abusing certain substances. But we also have problems with substances that we actually give people in order to help treat certain conditions. So the whole world of addiction is very, very complex. We tend to think of it as being a relatively modern thing, but actually if we start to go back and look at the history of addiction, we can see that there's a very long and very interesting history of addiction. I don't know if many people have seen this cult classic, Reefer Madness, something that you might want to check out after you've finished all of your exams and you've done all of your assignments, if you want a few chuckles. This is a public service announcement movie that has become a cult classic about the dangers of young people indulging in cannabis. There is drug-crazed abandon. Women cry for it and men die for it. So we know that within the 20th century, then there were already an awareness of problems with use and abuse of certain substances. Going back even further, then there were whole economic plans and economic ventures that were built around supplying and creating addictive situations. So the creation of the expansion of the opium dens in the Far East was very much supported by Western sort of colonial actions as creating a market for a drug. And there was ignorance about the consequences of using certain kinds of drugs. So for instance, cocaine toothache drops. This was a tincture, a solution that was prescribed for babies when they were teething. So when their gums were sore and the teeth were coming in, rub a little bit of that cocaine toothache drop on it. They'll feel better. Widely used, widely accepted. So there's a long and glorious history around addiction. And in fact, human beings have been using and abusing substances throughout recorded history. We've evolved to be able to become addicts. So if we actually look at the evolution of drug and alcohol use and some of these other, I have too many things here, some of these other compounds like alcohol, caffeine, tobacco, cannabis, opium, and cocaine, we can see that, this will load for me. Okay, let's go back to our, we can see that going back as far as 8,000 BC, so that's 10,000 years ago, we can see the first examples, we find the first relics showing that human beings were using, for instance, alcohol. So here is some pottery that shows remnants of resins derived from fermentation. So we know that people were using alcohol 10,000 years ago, and this is in the Middle East. We know that North and South America, they were growing tobacco plants 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And we can track the use of these different compounds through recorded history, showing changes in cultural practices, showing changes in policy, showing changes in legislation and social awareness. There's an interesting one from 2000 BC, so 4,000 years ago, where one of the earliest recorded prohibitive, telling you not to do it, teaching by an Egyptian priest who writes to his pupil, I, thy superior, forbid thee to go to the taverns. Thou art degraded like the beasts. Well, that's pretty strong sort of version of just say no, okay? So we know that there have been problems with human beings being abusing and using a variety of substances through recorded time. This is a great infographic that provides all sorts of useful and interesting information. We know that culturally things changed as, for instance, the Catholic Church became much more influential in the Middle Ages. The Spanish Inquisition considered everything that came from the Far East to be sort of taboo, to be not good, and therefore they made opium something that was very much frowned upon, outlawed. It was a sin. But then, at other stages in history, opium became something that was actually recommended and used in the medical profession. Look at the consumption here of some parts of Europe in terms of the amount of alcohol or beer. I think this is beer that they were drinking. Spain and Poland, 3 liters of beer a day. England, 17 pints a week. Danish and Swedish sailors, a gallon of beer a day. Now, if you're drinking that much alcohol, even if it's fairly weak beer, and it probably wouldn't have been weak beer, it would have been pretty strong beer, and you wouldn't want to drink the water, so you'd be drinking the beer. Those kinds of levels of consumption and that kind of amount of alcohol is almost certainly going to lead to addictive kinds of behaviors. So we can go on all through recorded history, and we can look at how human beings have been using and abusing substances that have been prohibited, have been recommended throughout as cultures changed and as society developed. Okay, so let's go back over here. So all of these substances then that are being potentially can be addictive then have addictive potential. So some of them are more addictive than others. And this is a table, a graph that's used quite widely to demonstrate the relative addictiveness of different kinds of substances. So on the left-hand side, at 100% or close to 100% are the most highly addictive substances. And as you go to the right-hand side, then they become less addictive in terms of what is seen in the clinic and what is seen in society. The red and the blue bars represent what currently are legal and illegal drugs. And what would you think would be on the far left, the blue? I'm going to answer that for you. You would think that those would be the illegal drugs. And in fact, one of the most addictive drugs is OxyContin, which is prescribed. It's a prescribed drug. One of the second most addictive ones is tobacco. It's a legal drug. Was illegal at certain times. Currently, it's legal. The next three, the red ones then, are the current illegal drugs. Crack cocaine, meth, heroin. Now, I have to point out, this is not a chart that tells you what's a good thing to take and what's a bad thing to take, okay? Just because these are smaller bands on this side doesn't mean they're okay. They're not okay. And by the end of this lecture, you'll understand why addictive substances really have an impact in your brain chemistry and can really change the way you behave. But this is to show that addiction is a very complex and complicated problem. And it's a complex thing to study. And it involves both things that we consider to be currently illegal or bad, and we put people in jail, and things that we also legislate and manage, and in the case of tobacco, government gets a lot of money for. If we look at this another way, in terms of thinking how are we going to handle addiction, what are we going to do about it, let's have a look at what kinds of harm is actually caused by different addictive substances. And you can see here that the most harmful in terms of harm to self and harm to others of all of these substances is alcohol. It's a legal drug, but addiction and abuse of alcohol leads to significant levels of harm to the users, to the self, and very significant levels of harm to others. Other drugs, methamphetamine, very high level of harm to self. Horrible, horrible, horrible drug. Very high levels of harm to the self. Okay, so, and it's an illegal drug, so if we were developing a policy around that, we might do it differently to a policy that we wanted to develop around alcohol abuse. These are all substances that humans use and abuse and can become addicted to. So there's a commonality to all of them. But in terms of understanding how we're going to deal with them, it's complicated because some of them are legal, some of them are illegal, and some of them have different kinds of outcomes. So addiction then is a state in which an organism engages in compulsive behavior. That behavior is reinforcing. There's some reward for it. There's some reason that you do it again. It's pleasurable. That felt so good, I'm going to do it again. Felt so good, I'm going to do it again. And that becomes compulsive. And in fact, really one of the best indicators of addiction is when animals continue to indulge in that behavior or that consumption despite adverse consequences. So even though continual drinking gives you a headache every morning, I'm so addicted I've got to have another shot, I've got to have another hit. Even though I'm getting sick, I'm not eating, not taking care of myself, I need my next fix. Okay, so that's really broadly defined the clinical definition of addiction. So why is addiction, why does it exist? Why would human beings indulge in these kinds of behaviors? Clearly, there's a lot of it about. They're bad, people get sick, people die. And the reason that people become addicted is because we're all animals, right? And all mammals can actually become addicted. Plenty of data and evidence now that all primates can become addicted. And even rats can become addicted. So this is a classic study whereby a rat has the opportunity to press a lever at will and receive a drug directly into a certain part of the brain. And depending on the drug, that rat will press the lever. So if you give them sugar water, they don't continually press the lever. They're not getting anything out of it. If you give them a solution with cocaine or a solution with nicotine or something, they'll press the lever. If you give them something equivalent to methamphetamine, they will press the lever until they drop dead. They will stop eating, they will starve. Even fruit flies can become addicted. They are susceptible to the effects of substances of abuse. They're susceptible to alcohol. And in fact, this is a study that got a lot of news a couple of years ago. They will drink solutions with ethanol in them, preferably over solutions without ethanol, when they're continually rejected by female flies. Now, this is a very well-established protocol. I actually worked with the team, with the researcher that ran this, and she is a world-renowned researcher in ethanol addiction, and she uses fruit flies as her model. She has a wonderful piece of equipment called the inebriometer, where she measures the relative drunkenness of her flies. So I can vouch for this research, it's real. So all animals are affected by common drugs of abuse and use. And that means there's a biological basis, okay? There's a biology that underlies addictive behavior. It has a biological basis. Why would it be useful to engage in compulsive behavior? Why would we have that built into us? What's useful about a behavior that's reinforcing? Well, there are natural rewards. We want, as animals, to go back and get things that are good for us. And those natural rewards are obviously food, water, sex. We want to reproduce. We want to go back and get the things that take care of us, that make us feel good. We want nurturing to be a reinforcing, rewarding behavior. So we have biologically built into us the capacity to experience rewarding behavior. And that capacity then is really the reward pathway. And the reward pathway then is what is hijacked by those addictive substances. We have it built in, but those substances and sometimes behaviors that become compulsive and those substances that we abuse hijack that reward pathway. Makes it difficult to study. Now, this is a slide that has the most words on it. I put it up here because I have to have a slide with lots of words on it. So, addiction is a primary chronic disease of the brain. It is a brain disease. It's a disease of the brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. It's a pathway in the brain. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to very characteristic, we can see them in fruit flies, we can see them in rats, we can see them in primates, we can see them in people. Characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and/or relief by substance abuse and other behaviors. Okay, it is those substances hijacking that reward pathway in the brain. Okay, so here's your brain. Oh, here's your central nervous system, I say. Central nervous system, okay? Your brain and your spinal cord. I'm not going to show you a slide of your brain on drugs, okay? I'm going to show you a section through the brain that gives you an idea of the different sections of the brain that are involved in different kinds of behaviors or responses. So this is a section through the brain. Front of the brain is to your left. We're cutting it down the middle, roughly speaking. And you can see that there are parts of the brain then that are involved in, for instance, vision, coordinated movement, judgment, prefrontal cortex here, memory through the hippocampus, learning. And then there's a section in here that is labeled reward. So there are a set of pathways, cells, bundles of cells, wiring in the brain that is dedicated to reward. And in fact, we can track this set of pathways and these linkages and this kind of highway through the brain, and we can map out the reward pathway. It involves some bundles of cells known as the ventral tegmental area. There are neurons that stretch out to connect with the nucleus accumbens, and then there are pathways that go off into the prefrontal cortex, which is where we experience things. This is the reward pathway. And we know that this is the reward pathway because we can, for instance, stimulate electrically components of that pathway, and then we can look and see what the response is. We can stimulate that pathway, or we can inject drugs into that location. If we go back to our little rat here, instead of giving a drug into that location, we are going to stimulate part of the brain. And when we stimulate the reward pathway electrically, we're mimicking the effect of that drug or that substance. And that rat will continue to press the lever because it feels good. Press the lever, get a stimulus, feels good. Press the lever, get a stimulus, feels good. And you can actually measure it, and you can modulate it, and you can study it. So here's our reward pathway. Let's now zoom in on this little section here and look at what might be going on there and explain what's happening. And if we zoom in, then those bundles of those areas, those bundles of cells then consists of millions and millions of neuronal cells that have very specific connections to one another that pass on the electrical signaling through the reward pathway. So here is a typical cell body. An axon stretches out to connect to a neighboring cell, and this is the way that the signal would be passed on from cell to cell. If we zoom in further, there's a direction of the signaling. If we zoom in further on that region, the cells don't actually touch. We have the cell that would be sending the signal ends in a little kind of a lump here. The neighboring cell is right close up to it. We just turn that around so you can see it a bit better. Then what we have is a synapse, and there's actually a gap between the two cells, a tiny, tiny gap between the two cells. And what all the nerve cells in the brain do is they transmit their electrical signals through the brain, and then at the gaps, they turn them into chemical signals, release a neurotransmitter across that little gap there. It interacts with a receptor on the other side, and the signaling passes on. The electrical signaling picks up and passes on through the next cell. And there are very specific neurotransmitters, chemicals in the brain that exist specifically and are concentrated in this reward pathway. And one of those is dopamine. So dopamine is present at very high levels in the reward pathway, and it interacts with receptors on the other cells in the pathway to pass on a signal. There's another one in the brain that is very involved in the reward pathway, and that's serotonin. And in fact, serotonin and dopamine are sometimes known as the happy neurotransmitters. They are very involved in a sense of well-being. And in fact, somebody said, technically, serotonin and dopamine are the only two things you enjoy, because everything you enjoy is experienced through that reward pathway and through the release of those two chemicals. So it doesn't matter whether you're drinking a fine Chianti, or whether you're eating a great steak, or whether you are watching a great movie, the pleasurable feelings are being transmitted through those two chemicals, very broadly speaking. So if we go back to our synapse then, we can see that dopamine is released. And if we look at the structure of dopamine, it's actually interesting. It kind of follows on a little bit from Dr. Viria's talk, is once we identify the structure of a compound, then we can start to synthesize variants on it, or we can mimic it, or we can build on its structure to come up with other kinds of drugs. And this is what actually has been done, both in terms of clinical drugs and in terms of making drugs that can be abused. And when you start to mimic some of those compounds in the brain and substitute them, then you can start to have an impact on that reward pathway. And here you can see a whole range of drugs. Well, here's dopamine. And here are some other compounds that have been built on our understanding of the structure of the chemicals in the brain to develop other kinds of drugs. These are all clinical drugs for the most part, apomorphine, but there are also other drugs out there that mimic the naturally occurring ones. So morphine, for instance, is a drug that you can take in various forms. So, well, let's say it's injected into your bloodstream. Let's say you're Sherlock Holmes and you're injecting morphine. And it goes into your bloodstream, and eventually all those little capillaries will lead out into various parts of the brain, and it will get released, and it will diffuse, and it will find its way into parts of the brain. And if it finds a receptor that is equivalent or has the same kind of structure to match with, then it will interact with that receptor. And morphine then interacts with opiate receptors. One of the other chemicals that's in the brain are the endorphins. You go for a run, you feel really good after you run. That's because those endorphins have been released. They're involved in the reward pathway. They're the opiates. Morphine interacts with the same receptor. So as you put other kind of compounds and chemicals into that part of that space between those two cells, then you can start to manipulate the reward pathway. Now, you can put more and more chemicals into that gap. You can have them interacting with those receptors, and they'll just stay there. But eventually, and naturally, what naturally occurs is that those compounds get transported out of the synaptic cleft. And that's important because it stops the signaling. You want your cells to signal electrically, release a chemical, have it cross the synaptic gap there, react with the other cell, send the electrical signal on, and keep going. You don't want to continually have that signaling over and over again. But what happens, and the transporter proteins exist in the membrane of the cell, and their job is to transport those compounds back in. So there is a dopamine transporter. There are also endorphin transporters. So there are transporter proteins, not as well known as the receptors, but very, very important in that they clear away the chemical messengers. And in clearing away the chemical messengers, the signaling molecules, then they stop the signaling. But drugs like cocaine, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are things like Prozac, alcohol, and a number of other drugs of both clinical importance and drugs of abuse interact with transport proteins. And they, in fact, block the transport proteins, so the transport proteins can't clear away those other chemicals. And what that means is those chemical messengers continue to signal. They continue to bind to the receptor on the other cell, and they continue to send that message. And that's how you get a reinforcing effect. So the signaling hasn't stopped. The signaling can't be stopped because the transporter has been blocked. Cocaine blocks the dopamine transporter and the serotonin transporter. Prozac limits uptake through the serotonin transporter. And you get a buildup of the chemical in the gap there and a continual activation of those receptors. And what that means is you get an enhanced intensity of the effect. So here we have dopamine being released. It binds to its receptor, and you get a signaling pathway. Well, that dopamine should be cleared by the transporter, which sits on the cell, in the cell membrane. But cocaine has come in through the system, through your blood system, through those capillaries. It's finally diffused out into the various parts of the brain, and there it finds a good match. It fits. It fits within that protein. It blocks that protein, and the dopamine doesn't get taken up, doesn't get cleared. It's not cleared out of the gap there, and it can come back and it can continue to activate. So what we have is a pattern of dopamine being released, binding the receptor, being released, binding it again, being released, binding it again. What it should be doing is being released, binding the receptor, and being cleared. But what we get is a continual activation and an enhanced intensity. And that's why a drug like cocaine makes people feel good, because it blocks the reuptake and it enhances that reward pathway. It's taking a normal pathway where you might eat something, tastes good, you get a little bit of dopamine released, it signals, the prefrontal cortex says, hey, that felt good, and then off you go. And then you might think, yeah, I think I'll eat that again tomorrow. But what cocaine does is it blocks that dopamine transporter, you get an activation, an enhancement of the effect, and it feels so good. I've got to do that again. It feels good. I've got to do that right now. I've got to do it. It doesn't matter what else. I've got to do that again. Okay? It hijacks that reward pathway. Now, different drugs, different substances of abuse, use and abuse, will target different parts of the reward pathway. And this just shows you some of the different components. Heroin, cocaine tend to be focused more in the ventral tegmental area. Cocaine, heroin, nicotine in the nucleus accumbens. Alcohol's pretty diffuse, but in a bunch of different places. But they all target the reward pathway. They hijack it. And it is those receptors and those transporters right down at that cellular molecular level that are being affected by those drugs of abuse. So it's the fundamental cell biology of your brain that is being targeted by these drugs. So we still see these questions, right? They still come up, and actually I'm quite surprised that Time magazine got away with using the same cover question twice over. So suggests that people still want to know why we get addicted. You know, what is it? What does it mean? Why is it happening? And why is it continually a problem? Why is it that we haven't solved this yet? But I would say that we are solving the problem, and it comes down to the biology. It is the biology that underlies those addictive substances and the hijacking of that reward pathway in the brain that is the problem. And understanding the biology then of that reward pathway and the molecular biology and the cell biology will really help us to understand and find ways to develop new therapeutics and new treatments. It is the brain that's addicted, okay? So I always tell students, when you start taking these kinds of chemicals, you know people that do, you're really having a very fundamental effect on brain chemistry. And that's very, very difficult to change once that pathway has been hijacked. My family, like many other families, has been affected by addiction. It is a disease. I think it needs a very complex set of approaches in order to treat it. It needs a whole population level approach. It needs family approach. It needs individual approach. It needs clinical approaches, behavioral approaches. But I like this quote, which is, "What's your drug of choice?" she asked. "Hope," he said. "That's the most addicting drug of all." And I think that's very important to remember. Thank you.